Imagine this. It's December 16, 1773. Boston Harbor is frozen under a pale moon, the air so cold that every breath feels like smoke. And the quiet streets of Boston are about to explode into one of the boldest acts of rebellion the world had ever seen. But before we get to the part where crates of tea go flying into the icy waters, let's rewind and set the stage. Because the truth is, the Boston Tea Party wasn't just about tea. It wasn't just about attacks. It wasn't even about angry colonists in disguises tossing cargo overboard. It was about something much deeper, something they didn't really tell you in school. It was about pride, about power, about identity, and about a people realizing for the first time that they weren't just subjects of an empire. They were something new, something that called itself American. The story starts years before that cold December night, when Britain, victorious from the French and Indian War, was buried under massive war debt. So naturally, they looked across the Atlantic and thought, the colonies are rich, the colonies are thriving, the colonies can pay, and so Parliament unleashed a series of taxes, the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, all meant to squeeze more money from colonists. But the colonists saw it differently. They saw an empire trying to control every part of their lives without giving them any voice. And you know the phrase, no taxation without representation. It wasn't just a slogan for a protest sign. It was the raw cry of people who felt invisible inside a system that treated them like second-class citizens. Because the truth is, no colonist had a seat in Parliament. No one in London represented their interests. Yet Britain demanded obedience and money. The resentment built year after year, and Boston, already a hotbed of radical thinking, became ground zero for the resistance. A place where taverns were filled with fiery debates, where newspapers mocked the crown, and where secret groups like the Sons of Liberty plotted in shadows. By the time the Tea Act came in 1773, London thought they were being clever. The act lowered the tax on tea, technically making it cheaper, but it gave the struggling British East India Company a monopoly, forcing colonists to buy their tea directly and in doing so, acknowledge Britain's authority to tax them. And that, to the colonists, felt like swallowing poison with honey, a trap disguised as a gift. Now imagine you're a Bostonian in 1773. You drink tea daily. It's in your home, your tavern, your gatherings. It's part of life. But suddenly, every cup becomes a political statement. Drink the taxed British tea and you're surrendering your freedom. Boycott it and you're defying an empire. So tea became more than a drink. It became the symbol of resistance. The tension finally exploded on December 16th, when a massive meeting was called at the Old South Meeting House, one of the largest gatherings Boston had ever seen. Nearly 5,000 to 7,000 people packed inside and outside the church, and remember, Boston itself only had about 16,000 people at the time. So this was huge. It was like half the city showing up, buzzing with anger, buzzing with anticipation, demanding an answer. What do we do about the 3 ships in the harbor, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver, sitting loaded with tea? Their captains ordered not to unload without paying the tax, but the colonists refusing to let them unload at all. The debate went on for hours, fiery speeches filling the hall, some urging caution, others urging defiance, until finally Samuel Adams, one of the most radical leaders of the Sons of Liberty, stood and gave the signal. This meeting can do nothing further to save the country. And just like that, the secret plan was unleashed. Outside, about 100 men prepared themselves, many disguising as Mohawk Indians, painting their faces, wearing blankets or feathers, not to mock Native Americans but to conceal their identities and symbolize breaking away from Britain. Because once they boarded those ships, they would be committing a crime considered treason, and treason meant hanging if caught, so anonymity was survival. Picture it. The disguised men marched through the streets, their footsteps echoing on the cobblestones, heading toward Griffin's Wharf where the ships waited, and behind them hundreds of townspeople followed, silent but watchful, like an army of witnesses. When they reached the ships, the men stormed aboard with precision, armed with axes, clubs, and sheer determination. And what happened next wasn't chaos. It was disciplined destruction, almost military in its execution. They split into teams, pried open crates, smashed them, and dumped the tea into the harbor, crate after crate crashing into the water. Thousands of pounds of tea staining the waves brown, the smell of it rising into the cold December air. Here's something your school textbooks probably skipped. The men were careful, almost respectful in their rebellion. They broke no other cargo, stole nothing, and even replaced a broken lock to prove their point wasn't theft but protest. For 3 straight hours, they worked in the freezing night, until more than 340 chests of tea, worth over $1 million in today's money, floated in the harbor. Spectators on the shore cheered, but they didn't interfere because they knew this wasn't about greed. It was about sending a message that thundered across the ocean. When dawn broke over Boston, the harbor was littered with soggy tea leaves, and the world was forever changed. Word of the Tea Party spread like wildfire, through newspapers, through letters, through word of mouth, carried from colony to colony, igniting debates everywhere. Some colonists cheered, calling it a heroic stand for liberty, while others, more conservative, worried it had gone too far, fearing Britain's wrath would come crashing down on them all. And Britain's wrath did come, swift and merciless. King George III and Parliament were outraged. To them, the Tea Party wasn't just vandalism, it was rebellion, a direct challenge to their power, and they couldn't let it slide. So they struck back with the coercive acts, known in America as the Intolerable Acts. Boston's port was shut down until the destroyed tea was paid for, cutting off the city's lifeline, its trade. Town meetings were restricted, self-government dismantled, British soldiers were housed in private homes, and trials for royal officials could be moved to England, stripping colonists of justice. Boston became a city under siege. But here's the twist Britain didn't see coming. Instead of isolating Boston, the punishment united the colonies. What Britain thought would break the rebellion ended up strengthening it. Colonies that had once been divided now rallied together, sending food and aid to starving Bostonians. And for the first time, a sense of unity spread across 13 very different colonies, binding them with a common cause: resistance to tyranny. The Boston Tea Party, in one night, transformed from a local protest into a spark that lit the fire of revolution. It gave ordinary men and women a sense of power, a sense that they could stand up against the most powerful empire in the world and not be crushed instantly, and that belief was contagious. Out of the anger, the fear, the punishment came the First Continental Congress, the uniting of colonial leaders, the birth of coordinated resistance, and eventually the shots at Lexington and Concord that launched the Revolutionary War. So when you think of the Boston Tea Party, don't just picture angry men in disguises dumping tea. Picture a moment when a people crossed an invisible line, when protest turned into defiance, when subjects of a king started becoming citizens of a new nation. It wasn't just about tea. It wasn't just about taxes. It was about identity, about freedom, about the birth of something bigger than anyone on that cold December night could have imagined. And that's what they don't teach you in school. The Boston Tea Party wasn't just a protest. It was the declaration of a new spirit, a rebellion not just against a tax but against a way of life imposed by an empire, a rebellion that would echo through history, inspiring revolutions everywhere, a rebellion that proved sometimes throwing tea into the harbor is about more than tea. It's about freedom.